testimony on the fiscal year 2018 budget request for the Department of Defense. Since becoming chair of the Defense Subcommittee, I've said, thank you, but not been heard because I didn't have the microphone right. I've said that the defense bill would be based on the needs of our military and the best military advice from our leaders in uniform. Unfortunately, after extensive conversations with our military leaders, I'm concerned that the FY18 defense budget request is not enough to address the shortfalls and damage caused by years of underfunding. The budget caps have enlarged that problem and must be repealed. For many years, military leaders have said they would get the mission done no matter the level of funding they received. That is no longer possible. And it's our job to make sure our military has what it needs to face the many threats to our nation. All federal dollars are not the same. During a time when we face threats from Russia, China, North Korea, ISIS, and other terrorist groups, we must prioritize our defense funding first. Our adversaries are rapidly advancing their tactics and their capabilities. The FY18 Appropriations Bill must ensure our capabilities remain more advanced and more lethal than our adversaries. The last thing we want to give our enemies is a fair fight. General Dunford, in 2012, your predecessor, General Dempsey, testified that we were living in the most dangerous era of his lifetime. That was true when he made the statement, and the world is so much more dangerous today. Unfortunately, I'm concerned that the FY budget request doesn't go far enough. Our senior military leaders tell us this is the minimal level needed to stop the deterioration of our military readiness. As you had said, Secretary Mattis, it will take years of increased funding to get us to where we need to be, and the budget request should be viewed as the first step for what is truly needed to rebuild our national defense. This FY18 budget process is especially complicated, and we have a big job in front of us and little time to complete it. The world isn't standing still, and the threats of today and tomorrow are not waiting on our budget cycle. It's my hope we can find a bipartisan common ground to give our military the robust support that our service chiefs and combatant commanders tell us they desperately need. This is where our witnesses come in to help us clarify what we need to do. Before I introduce them, I'd like to recognize our ranking member, Mr. Visklosky, for any opening remarks he would like to make. I'm sorry I messed up your introduction.
Listen, I've been called worse.
Okay.
I do have a prepared statement. Given the time constraints, I would ask that that be entered into the record. The only thing I would say, Madam Chair, is thank you for holding the hearing, or gentlemen, for your service, for your testimony today. And I would commend the Secretary of Defense for his very good judgment in bringing aboard Mr. Norquist as comptroller. Despite the fact that he graduated from the University of Michigan, I think he's eminently qualified for the position, given his 6 years of experience as a member of our subcommittee staff. And I'm very serious about that. Good luck to you, David.
I now call on Chairman Frelinghuysen.
Thank you. I am going to go through my remarks. I think it's important to say a few things, but first of all, I want to join all the members and Chairwoman Granger in thanking you all for being here, especially those brothers in arms that have sat together at this table on a variety of earlier occasions. Today's hearing is an important part of the oversight duties of this committee. After all, the power of the purse lies in this building. It's the constitutional duty of Congress to make spending decisions on behalf of the people we represent at home. Secretary Mattis, we gather here this morning to review the budget of the Department of Defense, the posture of our armed forces, and to determine how this committee can help our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines meet the many threats and challenges this very dangerous world has produced. Because when it comes to the men and women in uniform, their missions are our missions. We want to hear your clear priorities for making them more successful and safe. What is our strategy in Syria? What level of success are we having in Iraq and Afghanistan? Even as we have a policy to accelerate and to annihilate ISIS. We also recognize that threats are growing across the globe, from Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, transnational jihadists, hackers, and cyber terrorists. Your needs are great, but the current resources available to you are not adequate. We share your opposition to the BCA, the Budget Control Act. We will work to lift its restrictions. But this hearing is about an opportunity for you to tell us exactly what you need in the short term and long term. Mr. Secretary, I have questions also about the devolution of war-fighting command authority from our Commander-in-Chief to subordinates, both civilian and military. While we never want the President and the National Security Council to be involved in the minute details of operational decisions, we do have questions about how to strike the proper balance. Secretary Mattis, I hear the constant drumbeat of concern from field officers and enlisted personnel about the rules of engagement during visits to the Middle East, which all of us feel are important, and even from the perspective of visiting Bethesda and Walter Reed Hospital. Previously, they were too restrictive. Now I'm hearing they are confusing. In another important area, I think I speak on behalf of all of my colleagues when I say we endorse the marriage of hard and soft power, military capability and diplomacy to assure our national security as we prepare the Defense Appropriations Bill under Congresswoman Granger's leadership, and a state operation, foreign operations bill. We will ask you to weigh in. Finally, the General Accounting Office recently identified 5 key challenges that significantly affect your department's ability to accomplish its mission. These include, top of the list, rebuild readiness. Secondly, mitigate threats to cyberspace and expand cyber capabilities. Thirdly, control the escalating costs of certain weapons systems. And yes, of course, strategically managing your human capital. And lastly, achieving greater efficiencies in defense business operations. We do not need a special report to tell us that we have a readiness problem. I'm sure you'll do that in your statements. Or that the Department of Defense has acquisition challenges. But we do look forward to hearing your strategy to address these issues and their recommendations. And with that, Madam Chairman, I thank you for the time, and I thank the panel for being here with us again. Thank you.
Ranking Member Lowy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'd like to thank Chairwoman Granger, Ranking Member Visklosky for holding this hearing. And I welcome sincerely Secretary Mattis and General Dunford and Undersecretary. Your title now is Undersecretary of Defense, David Norquist. I know many of us sleep better at night in this very difficult world, knowing that you're there making decisions. Thank you for appearing before us today. We do live in such a dangerous world in which the threats emanate from every corner of the globe, including North Korea belligerents, ISIL's increasingly common attacks in the Middle East and Europe, Boko Haram and al-Shabaab in Africa, Iran's destabilizing activities in the Middle East, and state sponsor of terrorism, cyber attacks on U.S. interests at home and overseas, continued Russian aggression in Ukraine, to name just a few. The Department of Defense is tasked to track the quickly changing global security landscape and ensure the defense of our nation and our allies is both exceedingly challenging and costly. Secretary Mattis, your fiscal year 2018 budget requests $564.7 billion in the base budget and $63.9 billion in overseas contingencies operation funding. The base budget request is $52 billion above DoD's share of the FY 2018 budget cap in current law. The President's corresponding proposal to cut non-defense discretionary funds to pay for it would outright cripple important investments needed here at home. While I am very pleased that your budget focuses on readiness and strengthening our military, I have serious concerns about how this dynamic world would impact non-defense discretionary funding, which is equally important and contributes to our national security. Quite simply, the President's budget request forsakes critical non-defense programs, many of which support our men and women in uniform, contribute to national security, and even enable our ability to maintain ready and able armed forces. For example, Major General Jeffrey Snow, the commanding general of the United States Army Recruiting Command, notes that only 3 in 10 recruits can meet the requirements to join the Army. That's an extraordinary statistic. The 2 things Major General Snow recommended are, and I quote, something as simple as what our kids are fed in schools, end quote, and the importance of not doing away with physical education programs. And yet this administration would roll back guidelines for healthy school meals and proposes to cut $400 million from education and academic support initiatives, including physical education. Even retired General Stanley McChrystal has raised concerns, stating that public broadcasting, which this budget proposes to eliminate, makes us, quote, smarter, stronger, and yes, safer. General Mattis, you have said, and I quote, if you don't fund the State Department fully, then I need to buy more ammunition. Yet the increases you request come at the expense of a 32% reduction in the international affairs budget, which would put American lives in danger, a fact underscored in a recent letter by 120 3- and 4-star generals, and would abdicate our leadership in the world. This administration is heading down a dangerous path by proposing increases in defense spending, which I certainly support, while falling short of our obligations for education, health care, transportation, support for law enforcement and first responders, and more. Congress must reject President Trump's misguided budget requests and instead pass appropriation bills that support national security and American families alike. And I just want to say in closing, I've been on this committee a long time, and I'm proud to be on this committee because we've always worked constructively in a bipartisan way. So I'm looking forward to this discussion. I look forward to your comments, and I do hope we can approach this budget and all the other essential parts of the budget sincerely and be successful in creating an appropriate balance. Thank you so much for appearing before us today.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll forego.
Thank you. And I will do the same. Again, allow me to introduce our witnesses. Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis comes to the civilian leadership of the department after a long and illustrious career in the Marine Corps, in which he served in several senior command positions, including combat commands in Afghanistan and Iraq, before retiring with the rank of general in 2013. General Joseph Dunford is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and is making his second appearance before us. Like Secretary Mattis, General Dunford is a Marine with a long and distinguished career and served as Commandant of the Marine Corps prior to becoming chairman. Appearing with Secretary Mattis and General Dunford is David Norquist, who recently was sworn in as the new Comptroller of the Department of Defense. Mr. Norquist, thank you for being here today also. Secretary Mattis will begin with your opening statement, followed by General Dunford. Please summarize your statements so that we're able to get to our questions as quickly as possible.
Well, thank you, Chairwoman Granger, Ranking Member Visclosky, and members of the committee. I appreciate this opportunity to testify in support of the President's budget request for fiscal year 2018 And Madam Chairman, I request that the committee accept my written statement for the record. I'm joined today by Chairman Dunford and the comptroller so that hopefully if there are detailed questions, we can actually answer them all right here in front of you today. I would like to give an opening statement, Chairwoman, because I think I can address some of the issues that have been brought up already, and it should take only a few minutes. But this budget request does hold me accountable to the men and women of the Department of Defense. Every day, as you know, more than 2 million service members, nearly 1 million civilians do their duty, and in doing so, they honor previous generations of veterans and civil servants who have sacrificed for our country, and it's my privilege to be back among them. We in the department are keenly aware of the sacrifices made by the American people to fund our military. Many times in the past, we've had, as a country, to look reality in the eye and meet challenges with the help of congressional leadership, building the most capable warfighting force in the world. There's no room for complacency in the Department of Defense, and we have no God-given right to victory on the battlefield. Each generation of Americans, from the halls of Congress to the battlefield, earns victory through commitment and sacrifice. And yet, for 4 years, the department has been subjected to or threatened by automatic across-the-board cuts as a result of sequester, a mechanism meant to be so injurious to the military it would never go into effect. But it did go into effect, and as forecast by then Secretary of Defense Panetta, the damage has been severe. In addition, during 9 of the last 10 years, Congress has enacted separate continuing resolutions to fund the Department of Defense, thus inhibiting our readiness and adaptation to new challenges. We need bipartisan support for this request, as noted by the chairwoman. In the past, by failing to pass a budget on time or to eliminate the threat of sequestration, Congress sidelined itself from its active constitutional oversight role. Continuing resolutions coupled with sequestration blocked new programs, prevented service growth, stalled industry's initiatives, and placed troops at greater risk. Despite the tremendous efforts of this committee, Congress as a whole has met the present challenge with lassitude, not leadership. I retired from military service 3 months after sequestration took effect. 4 years later, I've returned to the department. I am shocked by what I've seen about our readiness to fight. While nothing can compare to the heartache caused by the loss of our troops during these wars, no enemy in the field has done more to harm the combat readiness of our military than sequestration. We have only sustained our ability to meet America's commitments for our security because our troops have stoically shouldered a much greater burden. But our troops' stoic commitment cannot reduce the growing risk. It took us years to get into this situation. As the chairwoman noted, it will require years of stable budgets and increased funding to get us out of it. I urge members of this committee and Congress to achieve these goals. First, fully fund our request, which requires an increase to the defense budget caps. Second, pass an FY18 budget in a timely manner to avoid yet another harmful continuing resolution. And third, eliminate the threat of future sequestration cuts to provide a stable budgetary planning horizon. Stable budgets and increased funding are necessary because of 4 external factors that are impacting the department at this time. The first force acting on us that we must recognize is 16 years of war. When Congress approved the all-volunteer force in 1973, our country never envisioned sending our military to war for more than a decade without pause or conscription. America's long war has placed a heavy burden on men and women in uniform and their families. And here I will note a few points on Afghanistan that were brought up during the opening remarks by the committee, recognizing there that our military posture is part of a larger regional context in South Asia. Our primary national interest and the international interest in Afghanistan is ensuring it does not become an ungoverned space from which attacks can again be launched against the United States, other nations, or the Afghan people. In this regard, our forces are conducting partnered counterterrorism operations, and we are supporting the NATO-led mission so in the future the Afghan people can defend themselves. This week, President Trump delegated to me the authority to manage troop numbers in Afghanistan. The delegation of this authority, consistent with the authority President Trump granted me 2 months ago for Iraq and Syria, does not at this time change the troop numbers for Afghanistan. Together in the interagency process with Secretary Tillerson's foreign policy guiding us as he implements the President's direction, we will define the way ahead, and I will set the U.S. military commitment consistent with the Commander-in-Chief's strategic direction and his foreign policy as dictated by the Secretary of State Tillerson. This ensures our department can facilitate our missions and nimbly align the commitment of troops to the situation on the ground. Our overall mission in Afghanistan remains the same: to train, advise, and assist the Afghan forces so they can safeguard the Afghan people and terrorists find no haven in Afghanistan for attacking us or others. The revised Afghanistan strategy with a new approach will be presented to the President for his approval in the coming weeks. The second concurrent force acting on our department is the worsening global security situation that was mentioned by all members of the committee in their opening remarks. And here we must look reality in the eye. Russia and China are seeking a veto authority over the economic, diplomatic, and security decisions of nations on their periphery. North Korea's reckless rhetoric and provocative actions continue despite United Nations censure and sanctions, while Iran remains the largest long-term challenge to Mideast stability. All the while, terrorist groups murder the innocent and threaten peace in many regions while targeting us. The third force that we have to deal with is adversaries actively contesting America's capabilities. For decades, we enjoyed uncontested or dominant superiority in every operating domain or realm. We could generally deploy our forces when we wanted, assemble them where we wanted, and employ them, operate them as we wanted. Every operating domain today, on the other hand, from outer space to air, sea, undersea, land, and cyberspace, is contested. The fourth concurrent force that we must deal with is rapid technological change. Among the other forces noted thus far, technological change is one that necessitates new investment, innovative approaches, and new program starts that have been denied us by law when we have been forced to operate under continuing resolutions. Each of these four forces, 16 years of war, the worsening security environment, contested operations in multiple domains, and the rapid pace of technological change, requires stable budgets and increased funding to provide for the protection of our citizens and for the survival of our freedoms. I reiterate that security and solvency are my watchwords as Secretary of Defense. The fundamental responsibility of our government is to defend the American people, providing for our security, and we cannot defend America and help others if our nation is not both strong and solvent. So we in the Department of Defense owe it to the American public and the Congress to ensure we spend each dollar wisely. President Trump has nominated for Senate approval specific individuals who will bring proven skills to discipline our department's fiscal processes and ensure that we do so. The first step in restoring readiness is underway thanks to Congress's willingness to support the administration's request for an additional $21 billion in resources for fiscal year 2017 to address vital warfighting shortfalls. Your support put more aircraft in the air, more ships at sea, and more troops to training in the field. However, we all recognize it will take a number of years of higher funding delivered on time to restore readiness, to strengthen the military. And President Trump has requested $639 billion top line for the FY 2018 budget. There's 5 priorities here. The first is to improve warfighter readiness, and that was begun in 2017, filling in the trade-offs made during 16 years of war, 9 years of continuing resolutions, and Budget Control Act caps. The second priority is increasing capacity and lethality, as noted by the chairwoman, while preparing for future investment, driven then by the results of the defense strategy that we are working on now. Our FY 2018 budget request ensures the nation's current nuclear deterrent will be sustained and supports continuation of its much-needed modernization process. The third priority is reforming how the department does business. I'm devoted to gaining full value from every dollar and we have begun implementation of a range of reform initiatives directed by the 2017 National Defense Authorization Act, and we are on track to enter into a full agency-wide financial statement audit as required by statute. I urge Congress to support the Department's request for authority to conduct a 2021 base realignment and closure process. I recognize the careful deliberation that members must exercise in considering it, but BRAC has been one of the most successful and significant efficiency programs we have. We forecast that a properly focused base closure effort could generate $2 billion or more annually, and over a 5-year period, that savings would be enough to buy 300 Apache attack helicopters or 120 Super Hornets. The fourth priority in the FY 2018 budget is keeping faith with service members and their families, since talented people remain our most valuable asset. But we must balance these requirements with those of investing for other readiness equipment modernization efforts to ensure that our military is the most capable warfighting force in the world and that we bring our folks home alive. Investment in military compensation is essential. Our fifth priority is support for overseas contingency operations. The 2018 budget requests $64.6 billion, focusing on operations in locations you are well aware of. ISIS and other terrorist organizations represent a clear and present danger, and I am encouraged, members of this committee, by the willingness of our allies and partners to help share the burden that we carry. Moving forward, the 2019 budget will be informed by the National Defense Strategy. I will then have the analytical rigor that I can recommend hard choices as we shape the program for the next 5 years. The Department will work with President Trump, the Congress, and this committee in particular to ensure future budget requests are sustainable and provide the Commander-in-Chief with viable military options that support our security. In summation, I need the BCA caps lifted in a budget, not a continuing resolution, passed on time, and elimination of future sequestration cuts so we can provide a stable and adequate way ahead. For those who are concerned that we are not asking for sufficient dollars, please consider the following. For 2017, we asked for $30 billion. The Congress provided $21 billion as a supplemental. Second, this fiscal year, we have requested the amounts I've noted already. This is a 5% growth over what national defense was funded for in 2017. This request is admittedly $52 billion above the Budget Control Act defense caps. We have underway at this time a national security strategy that will give me the analytical rigor to come back to you for the FY 2019-23 budget request, when we will build up our military to confront the situation that the chairman and I have laid out in our written statements. I'm keenly aware that we have the support of this committee, and we have over many years, but I ask for your help to inform your fellow members of Congress about the reality facing our military and the need for Congress as a whole to pass a defense budget on time. Thank you for your strong support over many years. I pledge to collaborate with you. And ladies and gentlemen, Chairman Dunford can give some military aspects of this that might give more depth to some of the things I've just stated.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General Dunford.
Chairwoman Granger, Ranking Member Visclosky, distinguished members of the committee, it's an honor to join Secretary Mattis and Undersecretary Norquist in appearing before you today. I'm honored to represent your men and women in uniform, and it's because of them I can state up front with confidence that we have the most capable U.S. military in the world. However, the competitive advantage that our military has long enjoyed is eroding. And a number of factors have contributed to that erosion, and we've discussed those in previous hearings. One is an extraordinarily high level of operational tempo since 9/11, which has accelerated the wear and tear of our weapons and equipment. Meanwhile, budget instability and Budget Control Act have forced the Department to operate with far fewer resources than necessary to meet the current strategy of record. And as a consequence, we've prioritized near-term readiness at the expense of replacing aged equipment and capability development. We also maintained a force that consumes readiness as fast as we build it. And we lack sufficient capacity to meet current operational requirements while rebuilding and maintaining what we describe as full-spectrum readiness. Of course, we're talking there being able to respond to both Russia on one end and violent extremism on the other end, and all the challenges that may fall between. The Secretary and the service chiefs have addressed that dynamic in their testimonies, and I fully concur with their assessments. But beyond current readiness, we're confronted with another significant challenge that I assess today to be near term. While we have been primarily focused on the threat of violent extremism, our adversaries and our potential adversaries have developed advanced capabilities and operational approaches. And these are specifically designed to limit our ability to project power, which we view as our source of strength of the U.S. military. They recognize that our ability to project power is in fact necessary to defend the homeland, advance our interests, and meet our alliance commitments. And as Secretary Mattis mentioned, Russia, China, and Iran field a wide range of cyber, space, aviation, maritime, and land capabilities specifically designed to limit our ability to deploy the force, employ the force, and sustain the force in combat. Russia and China have also modernized a nuclear arsenal, while North Korea has been on a relentless path to field a nuclear-armed ICBM that can reach the United States. In just a few years, if we don't change the trajectory, we're going to lose our qualitative and quantitative competitive advantage, and the consequences will be profound. It's going to affect our ability to deter a nuclear war, a conventional war, and our ability to respond if deterrence fails. Alternatively, we can maintain our competitive advantage with sustained, sufficient, and predictable funding. To that end, the FY18 budget request is an essential step, and it builds on the FY17 supplemental request that the Secretary mentioned. However, this request alone is not going to fully restore our readiness or arrest the erosion of our competitive advantage. Doing that is going to require sustained investment beyond FY18. As the Secretary mentioned, this took us several years to get into the situation we're in right now, and we assess it'll take many years to get out of this situation. Specific recommendations for 19 and beyond will be informed by the Secretary's forthcoming defense strategy. But we know right now that continued growth in the base budget of at least 3% above inflation is necessary just to maintain the relative competitive advantage that we have today. That's not to build the force that we need tomorrow, but simply to maintain the force that we have today. As we ask for your support, we recognize the responsibility to maintain the trust of the American taxpayer. And we take this responsibility seriously and will continue to eliminate redundancies and achieve efficiencies where possible. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before you this morning. And Chairwoman, more importantly, thank you for all you and the committee do to make sure that, as you said, our young men and women never find themselves in a fair fight. And with that, I'm prepared to take your questions.
Thank you very much. We'll now proceed to questions, observing our usual 5-minute rule, and watch your red light. I'm going to forego my questions till the end, but just a response to your opening statements. We request that you reach out to members that are not on this committee or the authorizing committee and make sure that they understand how very important this is, and what your plan is that says we will rebuild to this at this time and then continue for years. And the question answers, we have several members who are in other subcommittee hearings that are hearing right now. So I'm going to go to Ms. McCollum first because I know you have to leave. Mr. Calvert will be second.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Mr. Calvert and I will someday repay the kindness that this committee has shared with us. First, I want to thank you all for being here today and your service to our nation. I have 2 questions I'm going to submit for the record, but one I'm going to just mention what it is, because I'm very concerned about what appears to be, well, not appears to be, it is a growing problem with pilots across our services reporting symptoms of hypoxia and oxygen deprivation, and I've had some briefings on it, but I want to learn how more this committee can be helpful on that. And then another question for the record on the transgender policy and the way that's unfolding. But I want to state, however, Mr. Secretary, I find this budget to be completely out of balance with the needs of the American people. We do need a strong national defense, but we also must ensure that the needs of the American people here at home are taken care of. The proposed increase for defense will come at the expense of domestic investments for all Americans, including our men and women in uniform, their families, our veterans, and these are services that they all depend on. Life-saving medical research, support for our first responders, educational opportunities for for future generations, safe roads and bridges. So this is about making smart choices. And the Pentagon's going to have to be tougher on cutting waste and controlling spending, and I was pleased to hear in your remarks that you're on top of doing just that. And I couldn't agree with you more that we need to participate with the armed services in doing a BRAC. We need to be doing that. So you have my full support and count on me to work with you with that. But there's an example of how continued investment after 15 years in Afghanistan has left us in a stalemate. Just let me lay out some statistics here. 2,000 Americans have lost their lives. Over 20,000 have been wounded. Last year alone, 5,000 Afghan troops were killed in action, and the president of Afghanistan said that there's over 11,000 foreign fighters right now operating in country. Corruption continues to run rampant in Afghanistan. Afghanistan remains foremost a narco state, and the cost of our involvement, the U.S. involvement, is $700 billion. That's a staggering amount to spend on a war you said yourself at the time we are not winning, and that's from the Washington Post article on June 13th. So, Mr. Secretary, now that President Trump has fully delegated all the authority for troop levels onto you, will you be sending more troops to Afghanistan in the calendar year? What do you consider success, and will U.S. troops be fighting in Afghanistan 15 years from now? Thank you.
Congresswoman, he has not delegated all authority to me. He maintains strategic oversight. He is an actively engaged and a very hard questioner about what the strategy is. He has delegated the details of forces that will be allocated to support what he approves finally as a strategy. But I assure you, this is not a carte blanche for me to come up with numbers that are going into this. An interagency foreign policy-led effort. As far as what it is that we would be doing in order to bring this to a better conclusion, we've got to recognize that we tried to leave the Afghan forces before they were fully mature without the sufficient air support that would allow them to hold the high ground, to put it in military terms. So we are going to have to look at a more regional strategy, one that takes into account Afghanistan as part of South Asia, not looks at it in isolation. It's going to have to one that marries itself to reality and the current level of support that we could expect out of the leadership in the Afghan forces, so we don't add to their responsibility without preparing them for success. And if that means we have to keep advisors with them a little longer, then 9/11 taught us the cost of not paying attention to this problem, and we will do so. For right now, we also have to work hard on the counter-corruption effort there in order to make this government responsive to the need of its people, and in that regard, that is why State Department is an equal partner with me as we put this strategy together. We're not looking at a purely military strategy, and it's got to be one that leads to reconciliation. All wars come to an end. Our job is to end it as quickly as possible without losing the very mission that we've recognized through several administrations was worth putting those young Americans on the line for.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Good morning, Secretary Mattis and General Dunford, Mr. Norquist. Thank you for appearing before our committee. Thank you for your service to our nation. Most of us, if not all of us, agree that and understand that the base on defense must go up, and maybe more than the $50 billion that you're asking for. However, I'm going to have a bipartisan moment here. Maybe these sobering couple of days that we've had here, but the funding on military cannot be obtained on the back of non-defense discretionary spending. I think all of us here in this room understand that. It's not going to work. We need a budget agreement. We need the administration, we need the Senate, the House, to come to a workable number that we can agree to get rid of the sequestration and the Budget Control Act and come up with realistic numbers both on the discretionary side and the non-discretionary side. We need to talk about the entire budget, not just discretionary spending. So I hope that in the coming days that we take this seriously, and that's not just the House and the Senate, that does include the administration. So I think we all need to be working together on that. One issue, though, that we can do within the Department of Defense, and you, Mr. Secretary, mentioned reforms, is something I know I've been harping on, and some of my friends up here have heard this a number of times. But from 2001 to 2014, the active duty military has shrunk by 4%, while the number of civilian defense employees has grown by 15%. A recent study uncovered by the Washington Post found that there is approximately $125 billion in bureaucratic waste at the DoD. Now, I know many of my colleagues and the service chiefs pointed out the importance of our civilian workforce, especially our maintenance people and civilians who work at the depots. I got to point that out here. But this report found excess capacity in the bureaucratic overhead, desk jobs, held by civilians and certainly contractors. Secretary Mattis, I would like to give you both the mandate and the authority to conduct a reduction in force that would place more emphasis on performance. As you mentioned, the word lethality. We want to keep the best and the brightest of our civilian workforce while realizing billions in savings that could be redirected back into the department for readiness, procurement, and end strength. Can you share your thoughts on the size of the civilian workforce within the DoD as we grow our forces, and what is the overarching plan to match capability with requirements? Thank you.
Congressman Calvert, we are on track right now to reduce our headquarters by 30%. That's where you find much of the specific jobs that you've highlighted here. I would add that I've met twice now with the authors of the report that found the $125 billion in waste, as they pointed out. I do not agree with everything in the report. I've got real concerns about logistics. I know it doesn't look sexy, but I would tell you that the strength of our forces in deploying around the world is heavily dependent on those logistics elements, and just-in-time civilian practices may not work well on a battlefield where the enemy is trying to disrupt your timelines in terms of undercutting our warfighting capability. But that does not take away, in my mind, that I need to look carefully at each one of the wastes that they identified and address it. The best way to do this, I believe, is to get the right people into the Pentagon. I'm drawing people from industry, including those who saved programs that were in big programs that were in big problems for industry, aircraft programs, this way. They come in with a background of how to very analytically weigh the quantitative and non-quantitative factors so we can have a I would say a grounding in what the fundamentals are that permit us to revolutionize our business practices. I have 3 priorities in the department: strengthen our military, strengthen our alliances so we're not carrying the full burden for our security, and to reform the business practices. And I'll get these people in. They're being confirmed as we speak. It's ongoing. And once I have them there, I'm going to fully empower them along the lines you're talking about.
Ms. Lowy, Ms. Lowy, pardon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Mattis, during testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee in 2013, Senator Wicker asked you if you had observed that the international development budget is helpful to us in providing national defense for our country. You responded, and I quote, "If you don't fund the State Department full, then I need to buy more ammunition ultimately." So I think it's a cost-benefit ratio. The more that we put into the State Department's diplomacy, hopefully, the less we have to put into a military budget as we deal with the outcome of an apparent American withdrawal from the international scene, end quote. As the ranking member of both the full House Appropriations Committee and the State and Foreign Operations Subcommittee, I frankly am extremely concerned that the fiscal year 2018 budget requests drastic increases in defense spending at the expense of non-defense discretionary priorities, including foreign aid and international development programs. Mr. Secretary, do you stand by your statements about the importance of the foreign aid budget? And how will these drastic cuts to diplomacy programs impact future DoD expenditures?
Congresswoman, I believe America has two fundamental powers: the power of intimidation, that's represented here before the committee today, America's awesome determination to defend herself, and the power of inspiration, which is heavily conveyed overseas by our Department of State. Not wholly, but they're the lead on it. I have not reviewed, just getting ready for these hearings consumed my time to understand budgets that are rather extensive. I have not reviewed where the cuts come to Secretary of State Tillerson's budget, so I do not want to speak offhand without having done my homework. But I would tell you that as I read about those cuts, I called Secretary of State Tillerson. I meet with him weekly. We talk several times a day, and we agreed to put two of our top-level subordinates together. We're going to look at the priorities for where we need to engage in the world. This committee also gives me development funds, and we have married the two. We'll set the priorities together so that we get the best possible use of the dollars allocated to each of the departments working in concert. So that's my effort to reinforce on that and keep us together. And I'm confident this is also what President Trump expects us to do. So that's my best response to you. I've not reviewed their budget in any detail, ma'am, so I just can't speak to where the cuts are coming.
Well, thank you very much. Madam Chair, my timer is not on. Are we, well, maybe if I have another.
Out of respect, Mrs. Lowy, we don't put a timer on you.
Oh, you're so kind. You know, Chairwoman Granger and I have worked together a long time, and there really is outstanding mutual respect. Well, then I'll just take another minute. Because there's another issue that I am passionately concerned about, and that is cybersecurity. I am so concerned about the growing cyber threats against the United States interests and assets, both at home and overseas. If you could share with us the primary risks faced by the Department of Defense in the cybersecurity realm, how does the budget request support offensive cyber operations, and along with its elevation to a full unified command as specified in the FY 2017 NDAA, would Cyber Command benefit from ending the dual hat relationship with NSA? And what steps is the department taking to attract and retain these skilled personnel? And I've been so concerned about once an individual comes to your department and has gone through extensive training, we hope that we'll be able to keep them, because this is such a challenge I'm aware of from the private sector. So thank you.
Just quickly, ma'am, I could not agree more about the growing threat. If we'd been here 10 years ago, I'd have yawned and said, I don't see the big problem. Right now, it's at $8 billion this year, specifically targeted, and actually there's a lot more going into this because we're not counting in all the recruiting dollars. All this is just targeted on the cyber capability. I would tell you that growing from basically $3 billion to $8 billion in 5 years shows the priority we're placing on it. As far as the Cyber Command NSA split, we intend to make this a split that actually gains more unity of effort from a broader constituency, too, from other elements that are also engaged in the counter cyber threat. And lastly, I'd just say that the attracting and keeping the key people, the educated, trained people, will be very challenging. We recognize it because they can be offered so much more money on the open market than they can be offered in government service. We'll have to fight it probably with bonuses, but also with a call to their patriotism, which at times is the most compelling. And we keep a lot of young people around based on the fact that we need them to defend the country. But it's going to be a challenge, and I did not hear one word you said on this issue that I take issue with. I agree with you 100%. It's a priority effort.
Thank you, and unfortunately, I have to go to another hearing too, so thank you, Madam Chair. And I know we rest better at night knowing that you're in charge of the policy. Thank you.
Chairman Rogers.
Amen to that last remark. We're assured with you in charge. Let me quickly and briefly take up the matter that Mr. Calvert mentioned, and also Mrs. Loy, on the funding for the Department of State. We had Secretary Tillerson here yesterday, and he agreed with the same description of your relationship that you've mentioned here today, and that's great. But the proposed budget for state and foreign operations is rather draconian cuts. For example, economic assistance to Egypt is cut by a third, Ukraine by half, Pakistan by a third, Iraq by 14%, Afghanistan by 9%, and the like. That's economic assistance, not to mention the military aid side. Those are rather severe. Would you not agree?
I agree, sir.
Yeah. What impact would those kinds of cuts have on your capability to do what you need to do in these various countries?
In terms of a direct military impact, if I'm kept funded, then obviously I can keep the military, the purely military effort ongoing, and that includes the support for protection of our embassies, which is a constant priority for us. But I think that I'd have to look again. I'm not trying to get out of answering the question, but I'd have to look in detail about what is the capability that they're losing, what is it, and then we would have to do an analysis of what that does. And the concern I would have is sometimes these issues do not relate easily to a quantitative analysis, that there's non-quantitative aspects to our relationship with the world that are more difficult to come up with. They're easier to see, frankly, in the rearview mirror. That's when you see what's happened. But I just don't want to say something right now, sir, that I can't back up with some kind of homework that I've done already, so I can give you some authoritative answers.
When you have time to reflect on that, we'd like to hear from you.
Okay, sir.
I've been dealing with these CRs and omnibuses now for many years, and we're headed straight into that rabbit patch again very quickly. I don't recollect a time later in the season that we've gone as far as we have this time. Here it is almost July 4th, and we're nowhere near coming up with a budgetary number that we can sit down and appropriate to on the Appropriations Committee. So I want to encourage you to talk with the White House people, especially OMB, and see if we can negotiate a number that we can appropriate to here on this subcommittee and the other 11. Otherwise, we're headed straight into a CR with all that contains, or an omnibus where we don't get what we need to get in defense. So that's the dilemma that we're in, but it is also the dilemma that you're in. We need desperately a number that both sides have agreed to. And I am here to tell you that I think that's possible. But it does take some elbow work, and it takes some grease work, and it takes some effort. But on this subcommittee, we understand completely your need for help, and we're there to give it to you. But our hands are tied until we get that number that we can all work under. So let me encourage you to work your magic with the budgeteers at the OMB and other places. We appreciate your service, all of you. Thank you so much for dedicating your lives to our country, and we feel safe with you in the positions you're in. I yield.
Mr. Visklosky.
Thank you very much. I would just point out to the panel that my understanding is the deadline for the department to have audible results is the end of fiscal year 17, which is fast approaching. Understand from the undersecretary that that goal will absolutely be met, and I'm counting on him. What I would suggest, Mr. Secretary, is if we can follow up with your office. As you know, I have a intense interest on the nuclear posture review, the modernization program, and I appreciate your very thoughtful conversation in February. Too often, I think people have an instinctive response that we need a triad forever. You suggested that you want to take a very serious look as to what it should be going forward. I think when people think about the nuclear posture, they also think about non-proliferation, many of the programs being at the Department of Energy. But the third element, from my perspective, are those non-nuclear events or weapons that potentially trigger a nuclear event. Our country, others are working on hypersonic weapons. We have unstable regimes that what will trigger their nuclear response absent a nuclear attack of our own. And would appreciate sitting down with whoever you think is appropriate from the department so that I have a clearer understanding, perhaps chair others on the subcommittee, how the department works through preventing that from happening to the best of our nation's ability, where it's not toe-to-toe, somebody launches first, but there's some event, there's that new weapon system that's just kinetic, non-nuclear, that triggers that nuclear event. I think it's a very serious issue. We'd like to have that conversation.
I'll find the right people to bring up, sir. I understand the nature of your question, though, and I'd just say that I had not put those in my thinking into the nuclear posture review, so let me reconsider the guidance I've given them. We are working, obviously, the triad, should it be there, which weapon system should constitute each leg, and the non-proliferation. I need to look at this myself. After I get my head wrapped around it right, I'll assign some people to come up and brief you and get your thoughts on this.
Appreciate it, because I do think you've been very thoughtful on this. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Cole.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, Mr. Secretary, General Dunford, Mr. Norquist. It's good to have all three of you. I really thank you for your service, and quite frankly, it speaks very well of the President that you all nominated your respective positions and got such strong bipartisan support when the Senate considered you. So I appreciate that. Second, I couldn't help but laugh, Mr. Secretary, when I read your now famous remark about your sleep habits, and I thought, well, all of us sleep a lot better right now if you happen to be an American, thanks to you. So again, we're very grateful for that. I want to echo a little bit of what has been said up here several times, because I don't think it can be said often enough. When we look at the approach process, and I focus a lot on that, at the end of the day, there's only one or two outcomes this year. We're either going to have a continuing resolution, or we're going to have a negotiated bipartisan agreement. And as you've made crystal clear, the latter is much preferable to the former. And so I really want to emphasize that to where my colleagues are concerned, and quite frankly associate with myself with some of my Democratic colleagues' remarks. If we don't get to a good number in the non-defense area, we will inevitably end up doing something that nobody on either side of the aisle wants to do, and that's present you with the kind of dilemma that you outline in front of you. I think at the end of this day, this committee will give you at least what you ask and probably more. But again, if we don't get the process right, none of that will matter. And we can, they can authorize everything all day long until we actually get to numbers where we can appropriate. Things don't happen. I do have a question. I know you're, in the last part of really working on the national security strategy, and we look forward with a great deal of anticipation to looking at that. But I'm curious if you believe, and this may be a little out of your lane, if you don't want to comment on it, that's perfectly fine with me, but some of us up here have been concerned for a long time about the lack of a new authorization for the use of force. We're really operating off things that go back to 2001, 2002, 2003. We're fighting a different enemy in a different place than we envisioned at that time. Would it be helpful for Congress to explicitly have this sort of debate and come to this sort of conclusions, obviously with the guidance from the administration, input from the administration and experts, or is that just a waste of time?
Sir, I don't believe it's a waste of time at all. The chairman and I have talked at length about this in our private conversations, and the Congress making a statement like that would hearten our own troops. It would reassure our allies around the world. It would put America out front in terms of a united or the consensus of the Congress that this is where you think we have to be committed. I believe it's much preferable to leaving it to be argued about in bits and pieces over specific issues or troop strengths or something like this. And the chairman, I could have him comment too, but he believes it sends a real statement, sir.
Mr. Chairman? Yeah.
Congressman, that's exactly the conversation we had. I mean, I think it would send a loud and unmistakable message to our young men and women that are deployed that the people at home, in the form of the Congress, support what they're doing, and that there's a consensus about what they're doing, and what they're doing is important.
Well, thank you very much for that, because I feel exactly the same way. I think it's a constitutional issue as well, and I think it means a lot when people of your stature tell us that it matters to the men and women that we've put in harm's way to do difficult things for. So, Madam Chairman, I would hope while we all work hard, and I know we will, on getting the appropriate resources so that we have at least the administration's request and perhaps some more, that we also push our respective leadership on both sides of the aisle to stop avoiding a debate that needs to happen. I've actually worked with my friend Mr. McGovern from Massachusetts. We probably don't see eye to eye on the issue, but we certainly see eye to eye on the importance of a resolution and a congressional statement. So I think that's part of our job ahead of us too. It's not just to give you the resources, which we certainly need to do, but to make sure that you've got the clear lines of authority and the unequivocal support of the American people as you go about carrying out the mission we've asked you to do. I'm not going to take the rest of my time. I yield back. Thank you.
I certainly agree with you, Mr. Cole. Mr. Ryan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate it. I want to make a couple of points and then have a question with regard to North Korea. One is we just got back from a trip. We were in Bahrain, we were in Norway, we were in Germany, we were in Spain. And as a guy from Youngstown, Ohio, it always inspires me to see the footprint of the young men and women who are under your command, that they take their responsibilities so very seriously. They're so well trained. The point I want to make is that I don't think we do a good enough job of letting the American people know how important our role in the world is. When you're in the Persian Gulf, when you're in the Middle East, when you're in Europe, you're thinking about what we're doing in Eastern Europe with NATO. The American people just don't quite understand, I think, the prominence and the responsibilities that we carry. And part of that is losing the World War II generation, the people that were engaged in war, and all the rest. And so all of us, to just make a point, because I think all of us need to think about, as we're having these discussions, how we communicate that to the average citizen that's in Gary, Indiana, or Youngstown, Ohio, how important it is for us to be engaged in the world. And you're on the front lines of that. So I wanted to make that point. Secondly, I would love for either Secretary Mattis or General Dunford to talk to us about North Korea generally, but in particular, what does it look like should we have to make a decision in the next 12 to 18 months? If you look at the trajectory of where North Korea is going, we've got to come to some determination here about what we're going to do. and whether or not we're okay with them potentially getting the capabilities to be able to launch some attack, not just in U.S. interests, but potentially strike the United States. I think it would be instructive for the American people to know, kind of not giving away state secrets or getting classified, but just what that would look like if there's a back and forth between whether it's the United States or an ally that we have in the region and North Korea, what happens in South Korea, what happens in Seoul, what happens to Japan, because we hear a lot, well, just, bomb them. I mean, just take it out. Take out their capabilities. Can you just illustrate for us what that engagement looks like?
I can, Congressman Ryan. I would suggest that we will win. It will be a war more serious in terms of human suffering than anything we have seen since 1953. It will involve the massive shelling of an ally's capital, which is one of the most densely packed cities on Earth. It would be a war that fundamentally we don't want, and we would have our allies and us, we would win at great cost. This is why one of the most the highest priority efforts that President Trump has directed. He has invited the President of China to Mar-a-Lago. There were only 2 issues brought up in Mar-a-Lago, and this was one of them. It was that high a priority. Secretary Tillerson has this as a priority. We are working through China to ensure that China understands that North Korea is today a strategic burden for them. It's not a strategic asset. And China has actually responded in some ways positively. You saw them vote last week for additional sanctions on North Korea, for example. And I think that we're exhausting all possible diplomatic efforts in this regard. Next week, Secretary Tillerson and I will meet with our opposite numbers from Beijing who are flying here to Washington over several issues, but this one will loom large. So it would be a serious, it would be a catastrophic war, especially for innocent people in some of our allied countries, to include Japan most likely. But it's also one we're doing everything possible not to have happen and resolve this through diplomatic means.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Just lastly, one point. When we were in Kuwait a few weeks back, we went to this small little tent where they had 3D printers, and the Marine Corps was printing parts for different things that they needed. I want to engage the department in the future to make sure that you have the resources that you need. This could be a tremendous capability, but one of the aspects is they almost need like a depot for how to get these parts, get the kind of a design depot to be able to download these parts in places like Kuwait to really, I think, save us a lot of money, Madam Chair. And I know we're putting money into one of President Obama's initiatives for manufacturing innovation institutes, one of which is additive manufacturing. Great capability where you don't have to order 1,000 parts of this, that, or the other. You can actually print one in the field. And this is a way for us to merge modern technology to give the warfighter the capabilities that they need. So I just wanted to give you the heads up. We're going to continue to work on that, and I think save the taxpayer a heck of a lot of money in the process. So thank you so much.
Ms. Roby.
Thank you all for being here today. We've learned a lot, and we appreciate your service to our country and that of your family. So please pass that along as well. Secretary Mattis, throughout much of your military career, it was the national security strategy of our country to have the ability to fight and win 2 major conflicts simultaneously. And over time, that strategy has changed to a strategy of being able to win one significant conflict in one theater while having the ability to hold in another until additional resources could be brought to the fight. Accordingly, Congress has appropriated the necessary resources for force structure, procurement, and research and development to reach those strategic objectives. Today, with the rising threats all over the world, many of which we've already discussed here today, I'm concerned that should a conflict break out in one region, that our adversaries in other regions may use that as an opportunity to take aggressive military action. At the end of the day, with the president's budget we are discussing today, how capable will we be to simultaneously fight two major conflicts should that become necessary?
Implementing this budget, Congresswoman, will enable us to be better prepared for this. That's not to say strategic decisions wouldn't have to be made once engaged. And we do assume, however, that we agree with your thesis that in the event we're doing something in one place, the potential for someone to try to take advantage of it is a given. So we're completely aligned with you on that. You can see us right now engaged in Afghanistan, not in a heavy way. The Afghan army's carrying the bulk of the fighting, but it is still a significant draw on us. You see us engaged in the Middle East in the same way, and we're doing an awful lot of this by, with, and through allies. But your question goes to the heart of what if we have to do most of it? And this budget is designed to better prepare us, but it's going to take years to recover from all the damage, ma'am.
Thank you.
Congresswoman, I just add real quick, as directed last year, we did a simultaneity drill in the department so we could understand what really it would take to do two MCOs. And we certainly wouldn't want to have that conversation in this venue, but we'd be happy to share the details of that with you. We've done the analytic work necessary to really be able to talk about the capabilities and capacity implications of being able to fight in two places at once, and that'll very much inform the Secretary's strategy review that's ongoing right now. We'll bring that work into the Secretary's strategy review.
Well, I would like that. I think we could probably all benefit from having that information in front of us. Turning to readiness, specifically Army aviation, of course, our military doesn't go many places without Army aviators, and my concern is that those aviation assets are being stretched pretty thin. Given the global high demand for Army aviation capabilities, I'm interested in your thoughts as it relates to increasing readiness. It's my understanding that we have a shortage of pilots. I know we're short on Apache helicopters, and programs like the light utility helicopter look to be underfunded. So what are your thoughts on increasing Army aviation readiness?
You know, since near the end of World War II, we have dominated the skies overhead, almost to the point that we could start taking it for granted, which would be a disaster if we did that. It takes a lot of commitment, sacrifice over many years. There is, for Army aviation alone, over $3 billion in investment. This is building more Blackhawks, Apaches, Chinooks, that sort of thing. The Chief of Staff of the Air Force and the Chief of Naval Operations, Commandant of the Marine Corps, are all working with private industry now because we are not creating enough pilots in this environment right now to serve either the commercial or security interests, service interests. So we're going to have to deal with this as a national level problem. And, you know, we've responded to this sort of thing in the past. We're going to have to dust off the old thinking and find some new ideas in there. But we are working it right now. We just had the meeting with industry here last month with General Goldfein, our Chief of Staff of the Air Force, leading it. But all the service chiefs are engaged.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Capter. Sorry. Oh, Ms. Rutherford, pardon me.
Thank you very much. For first, Secretary Mattis or General Mattis, whatever, you know, I respected you and worked with you as a general, General Dunford, and also Mr. Norquist. You know, you've gotten a lot of accolades, and you've deserved it because of who you are and you've earned the position. We all talk about sleeping at night, but these are serious times for our country. But I want to quote you because I'm going to make more of a statement, I think, to this committee and to our leadership in the committee. You have said that Congress has failed to show leadership when it comes to funding the Pentagon. And I agree with you on that comment. For years now, since sequestration has passed, we've had 4 stars coming in and telling us how it makes it weaker and weaker. And yet we really have not done what we need to do to repeal it, both Democrats and Republicans. Times have changed since sequestration has passed. The world has gotten a lot more dangerous, and you've testified. And by the way, when you're one of the last ones to ask questions, a lot of these issues, North Korea and all, have come up. So I'm going to kind of maybe make a statement within my time. But I want to say this to our committee. A lot of us have worked together for years, and I respect each and every one of you on the Republican and Democratic side. But it comes a time when we have to do something, and that's this issue of sequestration. As dangerous as we are, and when every single Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine talks about sequestration, and yet we have not repealed this at these very, very dangerous times. And I think we have to show some action. I don't think we can't be concerned about Republican or Democrat or whether we're going to break the Hastert rule. I mean, all these things are just political. And yet we have an obligation on this committee, Defense Appropriations, to give you the resources. And if sequestration is still there because of idealistic political reasons, whatever that is, or we're not going to give this up if we don't get something else, that's wrong. So I'm asking our leadership and each and every one of us on this committee to really sit down and work a strategy, Republican and Democratic strategy. Now, we're very upset about what happened yesterday. Maybe that's going to be an impetus for us to do something because we haven't done it yet. And it's about time we do it. And my question was going to be, and you've already repeated it, do you agree with what I said that we need to repeal sequestration?
I do, sir, and I agree it's nonpartisan. Secretary Panetta was my boss a few years ago, and he was in a Democrat administration. He's a Democrat, and I don't see this as a partisan issue. This is an American issue.
And, whether it's a speaker or the leader, whatever that is, let's pull together this committee. We know each other and we trust each other. I have respect for every single member on this committee. And I know we all feel this way. Let's just get it done. I'm an Under Armour guy because of Baltimore, but it's a Nike phrase, just do it. And I think it's about time we really sit down and take care of that strategy. The other issue I have, we've talked North Korea, and I don't want you to repeat yourself. One thing that hasn't come up, I found a subject matter that hasn't come up, and that's the issue of hypersonic missiles. We know that Russia and China have developed hypersonic missiles, which are so fast that could put, in my opinion, our ships, our aircraft carriers, all at risk. And, I'm not sure where the Navy is at this point. And if it's classified, I don't want to get into it. But I really think this is something that has to be focused on and very quickly. We're talking about cyber, we're doing those issues and all the things that needs to be done. But when our aircraft carriers, which are so awesome, look at how many people we have, look at how we use them, and yet they could be at risk. And I want to make sure that we look at the funding and the focus, and that you can report back to this committee where we are on our defense and hypersonic missiles.
Will do, Congressman, and coming into the job, I've been briefed by holdovers from the last administration and new people coming in now, and your view of the hypersonic threat, the need for defenses, but also to ensure we have hypersonic technology at cutting edge is agreed upon. There is no pushback on it that I've found. We've got to move out. We'll come back to you showing what the program is.
Most people don't know about the issue, but I would like this, at least personally for me, but I think the committee too wants to hear about hypersonic. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Carter.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank all three of you for being here. You are very important to the future of our nation, and we appreciate the good work you do. And I'd like to associate myself with everyone who's discussed the challenges we have trying to put together what we need to do without a number that we need to work with. And any way you can help us get that fixed is a great idea. My world is all about the guys on the ground. I represent Fort Hood. I've got kind of a combination question I'd like to ask. First and foremost, Secretary Mattis, the Army is investigating very heavily in upgrading many of the combat vehicles. While these upgrades certainly represent increased speed, lethality, and protection, they cannot be characterized as significant leaps forward in capability. As you are aware, our competitors' combat vehicles are approaching parity with the Army. It seems readily apparent that we should prioritize investing heavily to speed up the development of the next generation of combat vehicles. Yet, funding levels for this effort has not increased over the last several years. Can you share with the committee your assessment of our ground combat vehicles and what additional resources you need from this committee to adequately close the capability gap? And I'll include with that, I would like to hear an assessment of where we are. I'm aware of the training changes we have to make at the National Training Center to go to high-end warfighting versus the warfighting we've been engaged in for 16 years almost. So where are we on readiness of our troops, training, and the vehicles that we're sending them to war in? And I'd love to hear from both of you.
Yes, sir. And we probably owe you a more detailed explanation of the program to get us where we need to go, because we're not there today, is the bottom line. This is somewhat a result of the funding issues and the distraction of war and the combination of those factors. But we have programs we have put together. The Joint Lightweight Tactical Vehicle is being fielded now to the 1st Army and Marine units. It's a joint program to get full economies of scale, spend the money wisely. But it's a much broader issue, as you know, with different types of vehicles, from armored vehicles to transport vehicles, and the various levels, types of vehicles that we need to get. In terms of the training challenges, I'll hit that, then turn the two questions to the chairman. What we have to do is adapt to the changing character of war. An Army battalion in the field is now going to have assets that an Army battalion didn't have 10 years ago. For example, surveillance assets, drones. We also have an enemy drone problem where we don't have the right defenses. Every Army battalion headquarters out there is probably going to come under cyber attack. That didn't happen 10, 20 years ago. So these new domains, these new technologies highlight the need to avoid a continuing resolution. As you know, under a continuing resolution, I can do zero about new starts to address the changing character of war. Let me turn it over to the chairman, sir.
Congressman, you bring up a really important point, and alluded to it in my opening statement, and that is, I think it's fair to say that the majority of our investment, and if you look at the Army's investment in 17, even in the supplemental, it was all to maintain the current capability we have. So we made marginal improvements in the capability of protection system of the current tanks, for example, but we don't necessarily have as much money in modernizing our armor capability as we would want to have. And that really is, as the Secretary lays it out, I mean, 18 hits readiness to include for vehicles. And what we really need to start thinking about 19 and beyond is tomorrow. And we have, for the last 7 or 8 years, one of the most significant challenges of the budget situation we've discussed here today is we're always dealing with the current challenges, always dealing with today's readiness, always trying to get today's equipment up to speed. And now we're at the point where there's actually a distinction without a difference between procurement and current readiness, because in many cases, either units don't have the full complement of vehicles they have, or we're starting to field vehicles that don't have a competitive advantage, or the competitive advantage, as you suggest, is reducing. So I think as we look to 19 and beyond, you know, modernizing our ground combat vehicles is something that probably hasn't moved the pace satisfactory to us. With regard to training, though, what General Milley has identified as now a requirement, I think your word is, Congressman, is all of his brigades will go through the National Training Center. And that's exactly to address the dynamic you spoke about, to make sure that we're not only prepared for the current deployments in dealing with violent extremism, but we're full spectrum ready. And that the armor units at Fort Hood, the mechanized units at Fort Hood, actually can conduct a full range of mission essential tasks that those units have been assigned. And he won't certify those brigades as being ready unless they actually have done an NTC rotation. And in this budget in 18, in the readiness piece, we're addressing increased numbers of NTC rotations to enhance the readiness problem you talked about. So I think we have a good news story on maintenance and readiness. I think we have a good news story on training. And I think the challenge that remains before us to address next year and years after is going to be the modernization challenge, because I'm not satisfied that we're actually doing all we can to build the Army of tomorrow.
Well, thank you for what little I've been able to figure out. I agree with that assessment, and I'm worried about it. I'm concerned about it. I want to make sure with this, we all know that when the smoke clears, it takes a man with a gun to stop a man with a gun. In fact, we learned that yesterday. So I wish you well, and I'll be raising this issue constantly. Thank you. Thank you. You're back.
Ms. Capter.
Thank you, gentlemen. You give a great example to the young generation of this country. Thank you for your patriotic service. I'm going to read some questions I'll be submitting to the record, and then I'll ask each of you 2 questions that I would like you to verbally respond to. I don't expect you to answer the first issues I'm going to talk about. First of all, I have deep concerns about our industrial base issues, and your testimony does reference that to some extent. I would just like to state the importance of dual sourcing of certain technologies such as small gas turbine engines. I have concern about that. Number 2, stresses on our U.S. steel industry due to severe dumping by China, South Korea, and Russia. And thirdly, real threats to our single-source domestic beryllium capability. I have a letter actually on that, Mr. Secretary, that I will give you. But thank you for mentioning the defense industrial base. Thank you for being aware of it. And in view of a lot of things that have happened with the global economy, why we need to pay attention to it. Number 2, I place a very high priority on U.S. energy independence. We're about 90% of the way there. I appreciate what DOD has been doing, particularly Navy and Marine Corps, with significant leadership, both in installation and operational energy efficiency, to move us toward independence. And I will ask you for the record to summarize the Department's role in achieving DOD energy independence, but also in terms of some of your technological investments, how you are helping America reach that broader goal of energy independence. My 2 questions are, General Dunford, 3/4 of a century after World War II, could you summarize for the American people, particularly the younger generation, the nature of the Russian threat and why the European Reassurance Initiative is so vital to liberty and affirmation of our Article 5 commitment? Secretary Mattis, the question I wish to ask you is, I really particularly gravitated to a sentence in your testimony having to do with the stresses on our troops and the prolonged wars in which we are involved. And can't seem to put my finger on the sentence on that, but it was right at the beginning. Oh, here. Our country never envisioned sending our military to war for more than a decade without pause or conscription. The American people ought to reread that sentence. But my question really is, Mr. Secretary, the GAO released a study on May 16th reporting that of the 91,764 service members who were separated for misconduct between 2011 and 2015 had later been diagnosed with PTSD or TBI associated with that misconduct. GAO found many of them, at least 23%, were made ineligible for health benefits from the VA. I would like to just express to you that I have spent a long time trying to get DOD to discharge to care. I have failed in that, though it's getting a little bit better. And I would ask you if you could help us to review the separation policies of the U.S. military in all the branches to assure that service members who need care will receive it. I will also place on the record from 10-year study we've been conducting with the Ohio Guard and Case Western Reserve University and University of Michigan and University of Toledo, over 3,000 DNA samples from separated service members who voluntarily offered their DNA. One of the most shocking findings of what we have been investigating has been that the most significant predictor of a service member contracting PTSD is not military service, but violence experienced by that individual prior to military service, which then military service complicates. That is a really important finding, and one that should be paid attention to on enlistment. And I just thought I would place that on the record. So General Dunford, if you could kindly respond on the Russia question, and Secretary Mattis on the ability of your department to discharge to care.
Congressman, first, thanks. And on the Russia question, interesting, we rewrote our national military strategy last year, and we took some time to say, what is the source of strength of the United States? And not a surprise to the committee, we went back and we said, since World War II, the strategic source of strength for the United States is the network of allies and partners that we've built up since World War II. In other words, the friends that we have that we can call upon for a wide range of common challenges is what's critical. What Russia really is going about doing each and every day is undermining the credibility of our alliance commitment to NATO and our ability to respond to NATO. That's what they're doing, and that's the most insidious thing that Russia is doing. So why is it important that we have the European Reassurance Initiative? First of all, we had an expression in the past that virtual presence is actual absence, and it has to be a physical manifestation of our commitment. In the European Reassurance Initiative, which this year is $4.8 billion, gives us 3 brigade combat teams on a continuous basis in Europe, gives us additional preposition equipment, but most importantly, what it does is it assures our allies that we actually are committed, and it deters Russia because they know we have the ability to respond, and they also know that we're committed, which is the linkage between the European Reassurance Initiative and the challenge that we face from Russia. But in addition to what they do to undermine the credibility of our alliances, of course, Russia possesses the nuclear weapons in the thousands that can destroy our nation. They also have significant cyber capabilities, and they have been using those on a routine basis against our networks, and we have seen that. And so there's a full range of challenges, and I would just say that in terms of capability, as well as behavior, if you look at what Russia has done since the Crimea and the Ukraine and testing Georgia a few years ago, both their behavior and their capabilities would tell me that of all the nations in the world that could pose an existential threat to our nation and that could undermine the credibility of our alliances and the international order that we have had and enjoyed since World War II, it would be Russia.
Before we go further in this, Ms. Capter, you used the entire 5 minutes for your question, and we have a hard stop at 11:50. So I'm going to ask our panel today to answer that in writing or some meeting with Ms. Capter, because we have others that are waiting. Thank you. Mr. Adderholt.
Thank you. Secretary Mattis, Chairman Dunford, Undersecretary Norquist, welcome. Glad to have you here today, and we appreciate your service to our nation, and know that you will pass along that gratitude to the men and women who work throughout the Department of Defense. I want to follow up on a question that my colleague, Mr. Ryan, had asked. If you go back to Operation Iraqi Freedom, the first 3 days from March 19, 20, and 21 of 2003, 1,700 sorties were launched, including 504 cruise missile strikes. We all appreciate the candor that a war with North Korea would pose a severe threat to Seoul and, of course, to most of South Korea. However, the concern is that this may be interpreted that by North Korea to mean that we're going to allow them to continue to build weapons that are capable of dropping nuclear bombs here on the U.S. territory. If North Korea fails to curb the program and the president were to decide to strike, my question is, are we assembling the resources that we need to cripple North Korean military in the first 72 hours?
Our intent, if we had an indicator and warning of war, it would be to assemble those resources, sir.
What do you need in order to do that, to prevent just mass civilian casualties?
The best thing, sir, would be to have such a strong military and diplomatic front, including international, that we force Korea to divest of its nuclear program, a policy that both the United States and China share, by the way, of a denuclearized peninsula. So that's the most important thing, is to make certain we don't get to that point.
But you have currently, do you have the capabilities to assemble the resources that you would need to cripple North Korea within that first 72 hours?
Sir, due to the nature of the threat, the dug-in nature of the artillery and missile or rocket positions within range of Seoul, there is probably an awful lot of damage that's going to be done, no matter how much capability we bring to the theater.
Okay. A report was released recently that highlighted the potential for adversaries to conduct cyber attacks on power grids. The article referenced the attack on Ukraine's power grid back in December of 2016. I know this may be classified, but is this area of cybersecurity an area that you're looking at?
It's an active, very active area of security we're looking at, sir. Okay. In conjunction with Homeland Security, Department of Homeland Security, and Department of Energy, and the FBI, and it's active, it's ongoing. We keep a very close eye on it, including this week.
Chairman Dunford, do you have any comments or on either of those issues?
The only thing I'd say, Congressman, is, just go through the priorities and then talk about what we do with regard to those challenges to our power grid and so forth. The number one priority we have in the department is to defend our own DoD information technology network, and then we work in collaboration with the private and public sector to make sure that we share when there is a vulnerability and the solutions to those vulnerabilities. And then we play the away game, if you will, prepare to deal with those threats that are outside the continental United States. So that's how when the Secretary spoke about the collaboration with the FBI and Homeland Security and so forth, the actual protection of the power grid in the United States is not something we're responsible for, but something we support. When the United States Cybercom identifies vulnerabilities or solutions to address those vulnerabilities, there's a collaboration that takes place. But what we really focus on is our own network, and then making sure we have cyber capabilities to take the fight to the enemy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Cuellar.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I also want to say thank you to all three of you for your service. I also join my colleagues that we need to get to a number in a bipartisan way, because we have to find that balance between the defense and the non-defense spending, and I hope we can do this. Otherwise, if we go in the CR, I think it's not good for anybody. I have two questions. Earlier, y'all had discussed the importance of a regional strategy and area resources to the maintaining of the high ground on the operations of Afghanistan. General Dunford, I know that in February you were in Azerbaijan meeting with your counterpart of this year, and I think we know Azerbaijan is an ally, and I think we know the role that they played during the Afghanistan conflict there. Would you give me your thoughts on elevating maybe the facility that you have there in Azerbaijan, or maybe some other stable regional ally there? Because we know that the Middle East is complicated, and sometimes our ally provides complicated situations to us. That's question number one. Number two, in light of the discussion of readiness, can you also discuss the importance of maintenance and supporting force readiness? Specifically, the readiness of flight training units have suffered in Texas because of an incomplete approach to the engine maintenance. And how does your proposed budget attempt to fix this deficiency?
Sure, Congressman. We start with Azerbaijan. As you mentioned, I was there back in February and had the privilege of meeting with their leadership, to include the president, and to thank him for the support they provided in what we call the Northern Distribution Network. We were able to reinforce and resupply our forces in Afghanistan as a result of the access that Azerbaijan provided to us. And I don't assess today that we need to increase that access, but we appreciate maintaining that access because it has been critical in allowing us to have global reach. And certainly our United States Transportation Command has a very close partnership with Azerbaijan, and they're very appreciative of the access and the support that we have, and we'd like to maintain that relationship. With regard to readiness, you'll see in the Secretary's budget a significant emphasis overall on readiness, a subset of which is the maintenance issue. But, Congressman, I'd like to highlight for you an important point. Back in 2013, when we went through sequestration, we laid off a lot of engineers and a lot of artisans and a lot of people that are very critical to maintaining our aircraft. They're critical to the triage of aircraft and identifying what repairs need to be done, and making sure in a very systematic way we get the right aircraft into the depot at the right time to turn it around within an acceptable timeline. We have not recovered from 2013, and many of the people that were laid off as a result of sequestration in 2013 never came back. And so the challenge that we have with aviation maintenance, and it's across all the services, the challenge we have in aviation maintenance can only be fixed. This is another argument for all of us collectively for having sustainable budgets, because we need to have sustainable budgets to recruit and retain a high-quality workforce. And when we talked about civilian workforce earlier, we are very reliant, as you know, at our depots for a quality civilian force and the right people to work on our aircraft. And predictable budgets and a stable workforce is going to be critical for us to get out of this maintenance trough. And in many cases, what you see is units that actually aren't able to man or unable to field the requisite number of aircraft for that particular unit. We call it primary aircraft authorized. In some cases, they rate 12. They only have 6. They rate 20, they only have 10. And so the budget does address the maintenance issue. We are trying to recover from really what has happened over the last 3 to 4 years, and appreciate your support and focus on that issue.
Thank you. Mr. Womack.
Thank you. I just got a couple of questions, or give you an opportunity to expound just a little bit. As my friend Tom Cole said earlier in his testimony, we are rapidly moving to one of two outcomes in the FY18 budget process and appropriations process. We're either going to have a bipartisan CR or a bipartisan omnibus package of some type, or we're going to end up with a CR. CR is disastrous. I want to give both of you an opportunity to, at the risk of sounding like I'm piling on the sequester, give us a real idea of what this means. If we are headed toward a potential continuing resolution with significant limitations on how we can fund the emerging needs that have been emerging now for a while at the Pentagon.
Thank you, Congressman. Just for an example, we cannot do the new starts. So why is that so critical today? Because the changing character of war, which this committee has articulated repeatedly this morning, cyber warfare, space issues, I can go on, counter drone capability. We cannot start that. We cannot start new starts under the continuing resolution. We also block service growth. For example, we cannot enlist people in the United States Army, and they need more soldiers. We all recognize that. The world's changed. But if we don't know how we're going to pay them a year from now, the only way we could respond if we didn't have the money next year, if we brought more troops in, for example, if a CR comes into effect, is we have to take the money from operations and maintenance. Now the troops, you're paying them using the money that should have been fixing their gear. I think, too, just look at what business would say we're going to do short-term contracts, repeated contracts now that we're going to have to put a lot of time into. You know how extensive government contracts are to prevent any fraud, waste, or abuse. And we're going to now do the same contract for a 3-month period or for a 6-month period. We get nothing more out of it. We simply pay, we double, triple, quadruple the administrative costs that deliver no combat capability whatsoever. In other words, it not only costs us adaptation, it actually reduces the result, the effect we can get from the dollars you give us. It goes into administrative error. It doesn't go into combat capability on the ground.
And it goes on and on and on, this impact of the sequester. And so what, and I'm on the Budget Committee with other members of the Appropriations Committee, so what is the right number for 18? That seems to be where we are hung out to dry right now in terms of getting a budget agreement out of the Budget Committee and onto the floor of the House. Is it, we certainly know it's not the sequester number, which I believe is 549 on the base. Is it 603? Is it 640 that HASC wants? Is it somewhere in between? Where is that number so that people like me can have an informed idea of what is possible out of committee?
Okay, sir, I'm going to give you a number, $52 billion over the DCA defense cap. It's $574 billion in our base budget. It is 65 billion in our OCO. But there is also, if you were to go above that, I think our priorities are right in everything we've given you, but I have reviewed the service secretary's unfunded priorities list, and I agree with the priorities they give if we go beyond the base budget numbers I've given you. In other words, that too is an area where the Congress can exercise its oversight and its purse strings, frankly. But right now, the president's budget, which I am defending and I believe is the right step to start reversing the damage and get us on the right track as we get a strategy right, is 574 in the base, 65 in the OCO, and there's about 33 billion in the service unfunded priorities list, sir.
How impactful is sequester on your planners at the Pentagon, particularly for the FIDEP, that because when you do your FIDEP, you have to look at what current law is, correct?
We do, sir. We have placeholders as we look further out because we all know that we cannot defend this country unless we withdraw from many of our commitments that we have learned over the years we need to protect our people and our interests. So right now it's paralyzing.
One final thought before my time is up. Impact on the defense industrial base is also something we don't spend a lot of time talking about.
Sir, the industrial base cannot be expanded to bring us when we know we need more munitions, for example, if they don't know 3 months from now or 9 months from now that they're going to still get a contract for it. In other words, they can't do something that would put the company out of business just on a bet. And so you're highlighting all of our concerns. I'll just tell you, sir.
Yeah, before I yield back, I just want to say we have to fix the issue or else we're going to be right back where we were, and that's with a year-long CR, and that would just be a disaster. I yield back.
Let me clarify one thing. Mr. Womack, on the numbers that you gave, you also included military construction in that, right? So it's not just our bill. It's the MILCON. Yep.
Yes, ma'am, it is. It is in there, the MILCON.
Thank you. Thank you. That finishes the question. I want you to just go away with understanding how much confidence we have in you. You have an experience, you're in a position, and so we have great confidence in what you say and what you stand for, but we also have great concerns about readiness. Are we ready? How much damage those cuts have done to us? We have a concern that we share with you, and that's a continuing resolution, and it's just deadly. It is a horrible situation, and we can't get to what you need with a continuing resolution. So any way you could reach out, you have such presence. People respect you. They look to you for the answers, and they have to understand that. If you'll reach out to those that are on the committees in both the House and the Senate that aren't on the committees, the 4 committees that make these decisions, it would make our the possibilities much better. That concludes today's meeting. Thank you very much.
that has a number on it? Put it in where the number is.
Is it on here or on here, the number?
Up here, Alex. So see, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
I have 7.
Right there then, one of these. I have 13 and 5.
Why did it all of a sudden turn on when I like?
Because they are on. Where's the off button? Right here's the off button. That's the off button. That's still, I don't know.
It's not turning off. Mom, it's not turning off.
That's okay. We put 13 in that one. I don't know. 1 second.
Try to put it in 16.
Do we have a 15, 16? This is the only one, the one that's not numbered. I don't see the numbered. Maybe it fell off. When I, no, we got, yeah.
Does it have to be?
No, it's just, no. It's not needed to make it work. It's just for us. Take all 3? Product, that's nice.
What's the finished project?
The new cabinet they gave for us after this one after the old one collapsed.
You what?
After the old one collapsed. No, it just says that 9 is on, and I don't